During the ferocious winter of 1816, when England awoke each morning beneath a sky bruised by volcanic ash and a silence that felt biblical, the world seemed to shrink into a single, trembling breath. Harrogate Manor, usually a beacon of order and elegance atop its rolling northern hills, now resembled a fortress besieged by nature itself. Snow smothered the hedgerows, froze the fountains mid-cascade, and reduced all sounds to muffled echoes. Within its stone walls lived 25-year-old Duke Edmund Harrogate, a man whose youth had been carved away too early by duty. His features, handsome, composed, undeniably noble, masked a loneliness sharpened by the expectations he bore alone. He carried himself with a gravity unbefitting his age, as though he must constantly brace against sorrow no one else could see. Below stairs, in the heart of the manor where heat and hunger competed for dominance, Matilda Rosewood moved quietly among the clatter of pots and fraying nerves. Only 23, she possessed a beauty that invited as much suspicion as admiration in a household trained to distrust anything extraordinary in a servant. Her soft features and steady eyes hinted at a gentleness that life had repeatedly tested. She had arrived only weeks earlier, a displaced survivor of the crop failures that had swept through her home village like a silent plague. The staff whispered about her constantly, her poverty, her loveliness, her supposed unsuitability for kitchen work, and every murmur found its mark. Matilda bore each slight with bowed head and tightening throat, determined not to give anyone reason to doubt her worth. One morning, after an especially brutal night in which the wind clawed at the chimneys like a thing alive, Matilda faced a fresh humiliation. While preparing bread for the household, her cold, stiffened hands knocked a bowl from the table. Though the damage was minor, the housekeeper seized the opportunity to scold her loudly, accusing her of carelessness, ingratitude, and bringing misfortune wherever she went. The reprimand cut deeper than it should have, for Matilda feared that every failure confirmed the belief that she did not belong. She apologized, gathered the shards, and returned to her tasks with quiet determination, though the heat of embarrassment stung her eyes. Later that day, word reached the kitchens that one of the tenant families had taken ill and their supply of food had spoiled. Though the blizzard raged with renewed fury, Matilda volunteered to deliver provisions. The housekeeper, eager to be rid of her for a time, allowed it. Matilda wrapped herself in the thinnest of cloaks, the only one she owned, and stepped into a world transformed into white oblivion. The cold bit instantly, but she pressed forward, guided by duty and a lingering sense of responsibility to those who suffered more than she. Each step grew heavier as the storm thickened, swallowing paths and landmarks. Snow gathered in her lashes, blurred her vision, and seeped through her boots until numbness spread through her limbs. Meanwhile, Edmund had taken it upon himself to inspect the estate for storm damage. His steward had urged him to remain indoors, but the Duke could not bear the thought of his tenants or servants suffering from neglect under his watch. As he trudged through the courtyard, the wind lashed at his greatcoat, yet he continued onward, scanning the grounds with practiced vigilance. It was then, near the edge of the orchard, that he saw a dark shape half buried in the drifting snow. For a heartbeat he thought it a fallen branch, but instinct propelled him forward. When he reached her, he knelt swiftly, brushing snow from her face to reveal pale skin and trembling lashes. Recognition struck him with an unexpected pang. This was the new cook, the quiet girl with the haunted eyes. Her breath was shallow, her body frighteningly limp. Without hesitation, Edmund gathered her into his arms. The cold of her form seeped through his clothing, yet he held her as though she were made of something precious. The world around them howled, but within him rose a stillness he could not explain. As he carried her back toward the manor, the narrator of fate might have paused to observe the sight. A duke, burdened by lineage and expectation, cradling a servant whose life had been all but dismissed by those around her. His jaw was set with determination, yet his expression betrayed something softer, a dawning awareness, a recognition not yet named. The snow battered them, But Edmund's stride never faltered, driven by a force deeper than obligation. He did not know why the sight of her lying helpless had pierced him so sharply, only that it had. And as he crossed the threshold of the manor with her fragile form in his arms, the warmth inside rising to meet them, he sensed that whatever had begun in that storm would not end quietly. He could not yet name the feeling, nor foresee the upheaval it would bring. But the moment he looked down at her paling face, a single truth settled into him with quiet certainty. Life at Harrogate Manor had just changed, and he would never again be as untouched by longing as he had been the day before. When Matilda's eyes fluttered open, her first sensation was warmth, an unfamiliar, enveloping heat that coaxed her back from the edge of oblivion. The crackle of a nearby hearth filled the chamber with a gentle rhythm, though the room itself blurred at the edges. She tried to sit up, but the weight of exhaustion pressed her down again. Only then did she notice the Duke standing a short distance away, his posture rigid yet somehow attentive, as though he had been guarding her without admitting it even to himself. Edmund inclined his head when she looked toward him, the faintest relief flickering across his otherwise solemn features. He asked softly whether she felt any pain, but Matilda could barely form words. Gratitude and confusion tangled in her mind. Before she managed a reply, he instructed the servants with a calm but unyielding tone that she was not to be disturbed and was to remain by the fire until fully recovered. The staff obeyed, though not without exchanging glances that carried the sharp glint of speculation. As the Duke left the room, whispers blossomed in the corridors like frost patterns across glass. No servant could resist adding their own embroidery to the tale. The Duke found her. The Duke carried her. The Duke stayed at her bedside. In the strict hierarchy of Harrogate Manor, such proximity between master and servant was unprecedented and therefore irresistible as gossip. Some regarded the story with pity, convinced the young woman had unwittingly entangled herself in a dangerous web of attention. Others smirked knowingly, claiming that no cook as lovely as she could avoid stirring temptation. Word traveled quickly to Lady Celandine, a distant cousin temporarily residing at the manor until social engagements resumed elsewhere. She possessed an instinctive talent for discovering impropriety, real or imagined, and seized upon the rumor with relish. A fainting cook rescued by a duke was proof enough, in her mind, of some unbecoming ambition. Matilda, still weak but recovering, soon felt the weight of those glances. When she returned to her modest duties in the kitchen, conversations stopped abruptly upon her arrival, replaced by polite nods or veiled smirks. The housekeeper, who had never favored her, now regarded her with open suspicion. Matilda wished only for the matter to fade into silence, but the servants seemed determined to resurrect it at every opportunity. She moved carefully, spoke sparingly, and kept her gaze lowered, not out of shame, but out of fear that any expression might be misconstrued as boldness. Yet even her silence was interpreted as guilt by those eager for a scandal. One morning, as she folded linens in the servant hallway, she discovered a small parcel tucked beneath the stack. Inside lay a pair of winter gloves, finely made and far too expensive for anyone of her station to own. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. These had been chosen with care. A note accompanied the gift, written in Edmund's unmistakably elegant hand, though it bore no signature. For warmth, should necessity ever compel you to face the cold again. Matilda's breath caught. Gratitude warred with trepidation. Such an offering, however innocent in intent, could ruin her if seen by the wrong eyes. She hid the gloves beneath her skirts and vowed to return them when opportunity allowed, unaware that fate had already set its own course. Unfortunately, Lady Celandine noticed the missing parcel from a table where it had been temporarily placed during the Duke's morning errands, and she began to probe the servants for any sign of misplaced nobility. Her efforts were rewarded when she glimpsed the edge of the gloves in Matilda's apron pocket later that afternoon. The lady's eyes gleamed with triumph as she confronted the housekeeper privately, spinning a tale that hinted at impropriety while never quite accusing either party outright. Matilda was summoned and interrogated with merciless precision, her explanations dismissed as feeble attempts to mask manipulation. The humiliation cut deeper than any previous slight, for this accusation threatened not just her position but her integrity, her last remaining anchor. Edmund, passing near the servants' corridor, overheard a shard of the confrontation. He paused, listening as Lady Celandine insinuated that Matilda had cleverly taken advantage of the Duke's compassion. His expression hardened. When he entered the room, the housekeeper and Lady Celandine fell instantly silent. Edmund's gaze swept across them before settling on Matilda, whose trembling hands betrayed her distress. He addressed the two offenders with restrained fury, declaring that Miss Rosewood had demonstrated courage beyond measure and deserved not suspicion but respect. His voice, though calm, carried an authority that silenced any further challenge. Lady Celandine retreated, stung by reprimand. Her smile tightened into something brittle. Despite his defense, Matilda felt no relief. Instead, a deeper anxiety took root. The Duke's intervention, however noble, only intensified the scrutiny surrounding them. She feared that every glance, every word spoken within earshot, would now be weighed against their reputations. That evening, after finishing her duties, she sat alone near the kitchen hearth, reflecting on the path that had led her here. She owed the Duke her life, yet she could not allow gratitude to become a burden he must justify to others. The gloves remained hidden beneath her cot, untouched. Unbeknownst to her, Edmund walked the upper halls that same night, wrestling with thoughts he had never sought. Her bravery, her dignity, her resilience in the face of cruelty, these qualities lingered in his mind long after reason insisted they should fade. He could not understand why her suffering affected him so profoundly, yet each attempt to dismiss the feeling only strengthened it. What began as concern now curled around his heart with quiet insistence. By the time dawn approached, Matilda had reached a decision. She must distance herself from him before whispers became ruin. And at that same moment, Edmund realized he had no intention of stepping back, not when something within him had awakened at last. Night settled quietly over Harrogate Manor, its vast halls softened by candlelight and the distant murmur of winter wind pressing against the panes. Most of the household had retired, leaving the kitchens hushed save for the faint simmer of broth and the steady scrape of Matilda's ladle as she tended a pot meant for an ailing stable boy. She worked alone by choice, her movements deliberate, as though discipline could calm the turmoil that had grown impossible to ignore. The Duke's defense earlier that day had unsettled her more deeply than the accusations themselves. Gratitude warred with a sharper fear that his kindness, if misunderstood, would cost him dearly. She had seen too much of life's harshness to mistake generosity for romantic fancy, yet she sensed a shift in him that frightened her with its sincerity. Edmund entered the kitchen so quietly she did not hear him at first. His footsteps were not the commanding strides of noblemen, but measured, contemplative, as though he feared disturbing the fragile peace of the room. When she finally noticed his presence, she stiffened, unsure whether to bow, curtsy, or flee. He lifted a hand gently, granting her ease rather than demanding formality. For a moment, neither spoke. The glow of the hearth cast them in warm relief. Two figures divided by class, yet drawn together by an inexplicable current neither fully understood. He asked whether she felt improved after her ordeal, his voice restrained but laced with concern. Matilda nodded, offering a polite reply, though her gaze remained fixed on the broth. Edmund stepped closer, though still at a respectful distance, and remarked that she was working far too late for someone just recovered from exposure. She answered that necessity rarely bowed to comfort. The remark struck him with unexpected force. He realized how foreign such resilience was within the aristocratic world, where hardship seldom crossed thresholds without invitation. Sensing her unease, Edmund softened his tone, confessing that he had come to apologize for the scene earlier. He had not intended to embarrass her. He merely could not stand by while her honor was questioned. Matilda tightened her grip on the ladle, whispering that his intervention had only intensified the scrutiny upon them both. He acknowledged this with a faint nod, admitting that he had been reckless, but not regretful. His eyes lingered on her with quiet intensity, revealing more emotion than propriety allowed. She tried to deflect, insisting she was unworthy of such defense. Edmund's brow furrowed. He asked why she believed her worth so meager, and the question broke something inside her that she had fought desperately to hold intact. With a trembling breath, she told him of her village's collapse, of her parents' illness, the famine, the relentless cold that stole neighbors and kin alike. She described the heavy guilt of survival, the silence of empty hearths, the way misfortune clung like shadow no matter how far she traveled. She ended with a whisper. She was no one, and expecting anything more was dangerous foolishness. Edmund stood motionless, struck by the rawness of her confession. The weight she carried was far greater than he had imagined, yet she bore it with grace. In her voice he heard not weakness, but the echo of a strength unacknowledged. He stepped closer, closing the distance by deliberate degrees, and told her she was wrong. She was not no one. He spoke of the moment he had found her in the snow, how the sight had shaken him with fear unlike any he had known. He admitted that her courage, her resilience, and the quiet dignity she tried so hard to conceal had stirred something in him he did not yet have a language to name. She attempted to silence him, urging that such thoughts endangered them both. But Edmund continued, his voice low and unwavering. He confessed that since the storm, he had felt as though a veil had lifted from his life, a life built upon duty, expectation, and isolation. Matilda, in all her humility and strength, had awakened a longing he had long believed himself incapable of feeling. At last, he spoke the words that had haunted him ever since his first impulsive utterance. She was the one he had waited for. Not a noble woman chosen for alliances, not a bride groomed by society's demands, but someone whose courage illuminated the very hollows of his heart. The words hung in the air with perilous brilliance. Matilda's breath caught. She felt the truth of his confession, not merely in its sentiment, but in the tremor beneath his control. Such a declaration, spoken here in the quiet of the kitchen, felt both impossibly intimate and catastrophically dangerous. She backed away, her chest tight, insisting that he must not speak so plainly, that he risked his title, his reputation, his future. Edmund's gaze softened with understanding rather than frustration. He told her he feared none of those losses as much as he feared a life lived without honesty. The tension broke her resolve. With eyes shimmering, she whispered that she could not be the cause of his ruin. Without waiting for his reply, she fled the kitchen, abandoning her ladle and composure alike, leaving Edmund standing alone amid the warm glow of the hearth. He watched the doorway through which she had vanished, a fierce determination kindling within him. If she feared the world's judgment, then he would confront the world. If she doubted her worth, he would prove it beyond question. As the last embers crackled in the silence, Edmund realized he had crossed an unseen threshold. Whatever course lay ahead would demand courage from them both. Yet he knew with unshakable certainty that retreat was no longer possible. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as though reluctant to release the land it had held captive for months. Yet even as the first fragile hints of thaw touched Harrogate Manor, tension tightened around its inhabitants like an invisible cord. Rumors that once simmered discreetly now boiled over the boundaries of the estate and trickled through the nearby village. The Duke's defense of a servant girl, his repeated inquiries into her welfare, the sharp reprimand he had delivered to Lady Celandine, had become fodder for speculation far beyond the manor walls. Whispers in the market imagined scandalous entanglements. Innkeepers recounted exaggerated tales of impropriety, and the local gentry exchanged knowing looks whenever Edmund's name surfaced. In their world, affection across class lines was not merely improbable. It was a transgression that threatened the fragile architecture of society itself. A formal letter soon arrived at Harrogate, penned by several neighboring aristocrats who claimed to act out of concern for Edmund's reputation. Its tone was measured yet unmistakably superior, advising him to rectify recent lapses in discernment by dismissing Matilda Rosewood at once. The implication was clear: retain her and risk becoming an object of ridicule. Edmund read the letter twice, then folded it with a calmness that belied the storm rising within him. He did not summon his steward or request counsel from the family solicitor. Instead, he set the letter aside as though it were no more significant than an unpaid bill and walked toward the lower corridors of the manor, a decision crystallizing in him with irrevocable clarity. He found Matilda in the kitchen garden, attempting to coax early herbs from the reluctant soil. Her hands moved carefully, though her posture betrayed a weariness deeper than fatigue. When she noticed Edmund approaching, fear flickered in her eyes. She rose, brushing dirt from her apron, already suspecting the purpose of his visit. She told him she understood the necessity of her dismissal, that her presence had become a burden he should not be expected to bear. Her voice was steady, but the resignation in it wounded him more than any accusation ever could. Edmund stepped closer, the early spring air carrying the faint scent of thawing earth between them. He told her no dismissal would occur. Not today, not ever at someone else's command. She tried to insist, reminding him of the ridicule, the letters, the expectations. He interrupted gently but firmly, telling her that expectations had governed his life long enough. The world could judge him, but it would not dictate whom he chose to esteem. His words held none of the impulsive passion of a youthful infatuation. Instead, they carried the weight of a man who had lived in silence for too long and now found truth more vital than reputation. Still, Matilda shook her head, her resolve trembling at the edges. She confessed that each whispered rumor felt like a stone pressed on her chest, and she feared that her presence would sour his alliances, cripple his influence, and rob him of choices he had not yet even made. Edmund listened with patience, but his response was unwavering. Influence he could rebuild, alliances he could forge anew, but the rare, unlooked-for connection between them was something he would not abandon to appease the fragile pride of others. He reached for her hand, not with the entitlement of nobility, but with the humility of a man seeking permission. When she did not pull away, he held her fingers gently and told her she had given him something no title, estate, or marriage of convenience had ever offered: the sense of being seen not as a duke, but as a man. As days passed, Edmund's steadfastness began to ripple through the manor. His open acknowledgment of Matilda, his choice to walk alongside her in the gardens, his insistence she be treated with dignity, sparked outrage in some and surprise in others. Yet something subtle began to shift. The manor's oldest retainer, a man who had served Edmund's father with unbroken loyalty, approached the Duke one afternoon and declared his support in quiet, solemn words. He had watched Edmund grow from boy to man, had witnessed his burdens and sacrifices, and believed that any woman capable of stirring such sincerity in him could not be unworthy. His endorsement, though private, marked a change. The staff, once eager to gossip, now spoke more cautiously, and the more perceptive among them began to see Matilda not as an interloper, but as a woman of strength who had endured far more than she revealed. Spring advanced with increasing confidence, thawing fields and softening tempers. Edmund, in full defiance of propriety, yet guided by unwavering conviction, sought out Matilda in the small chapel adjacent to the manor grounds. She stood before the altar arranging early blooms, unaware of his approach. When she turned and saw him, her expression held a mixture of longing and fear, the constant battle between heart and circumstance. Edmund walked toward her, his steps sure, and told her he wished to speak without hesitation or retreat. Before she could object, he declared that he intended to make her his wife, not in secret, not in shame, but openly, with vows that would bind their futures together regardless of what society whispered. Matilda's breath faltered. The enormity of his words settled upon her like a warm, disbelieving tide. She asked whether he was prepared for the consequences such a union would bring. Edmund answered that no consequence could outweigh losing her. His voice carried a sincerity so profound that every crumbling barrier within her seemed to fall at once. Tears, fragile as dewdrops, gathered in her eyes as she whispered her acceptance. Their wedding took place days later, modest yet radiant, attended by those who truly understood loyalty rather than superficial distinction. Matilda walked the aisle not as a servant elevated, but as a woman cherished. Edmund's vows were steady, spoken with the quiet intensity of a man who had found his heart after years of searching without knowing he searched at all. And when spring sunlight poured through the chapel windows, illuminating them in gentle gold, the final remnants of winter's grief melted away. So it was that in the year the world forgot its summer, two hearts discovered a season of their own, one rooted in courage, truth, and the faith that love, when chosen boldly, could rewrite destiny itself. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.